The unraveling of Judge Samuel Hayes. The early morning light filtered through the grand arched windows of the city courthouse, casting elongated shadows across Judge Samuel Hayes' desk. The scent of polished mahogany mingled with the faint aroma of stale coffee, a familiar fragrance in his office. His gavel lay on the heavy wooden desk, an ever-present reminder of the authority he wielded. For 15 years, he had worn the robe of justice, never wavering, never breaking, never letting emotions cloud his judgment. The city knew him as Iron Hayes, a man as unyielding as the law itself. He was fair, but detached. His court was no place for sentiment. That morning, he flipped through the day's docket with his usual efficiency, scanning names and charges without a flicker of emotion. Then, a name made his breath hitch. Matthews, Brock, and James. Minor guardianship review. He had seen hundreds of foster cases in his time, but something about this file unsettled him. Maybe it was the frequency of their moves, 4 homes in 3 years. Maybe it was the social worker's notes, withdrawn, high anxiety, protective of each other. Or maybe it was something else, something he couldn't quite place yet. The courtroom that changed everything. By 9 a.m., the courtroom was filled with the usual cacophony of whispers, shuffled papers, and the murmurs of attorneys preparing their clients for judgment. The scent of starched suits and nervous anticipation thickened the air. Judge Hayes sat at the bench, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. As the first cases passed swiftly, he found himself glancing at the clock, counting down the minutes to the Matthews hearing. He told himself it was routine. Then the bailiff called their names. 2 small figures stepped forward. Brock and James Matthews were identical, with wiry frames, deep brown eyes, and tight curls that framed their faces. They were barely 9, yet their eyes carried a weight no child should bear. They clutched each other's hands tightly, as if letting go would mean disappearing into the system forever. Their current foster mother, Mrs. Langley, sat a few rows ahead, her expression one of tired disinterest. Their attorney began, "Your Honor, we are here today to extend the placement of Brock and James with the Langley household. All necessary documents are in order." Then a voice cut through the room. A child's voice. "Excuse me, Your Honor," Brock said, standing abruptly, his small fingers still curled tightly around his brother's hand. Judge Hayes arched a brow. Children didn't interrupt. They weren't supposed to. "Sit down, son," the lawyer whispered harshly, but Brock didn't. Instead, he stepped forward, his voice trembling yet determined. "Please adopt us, sir." A hush fell over the courtroom. The hum of whispers and shuffling papers ceased. Hayes felt his grip tighten around his gavel, the weight of the moment sinking in like a slow burn. Brock's lip quivered, but he held his ground. "You're the only one who seems to care," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We won't be any trouble. We promise." Beside him, James, usually the quieter of the two, squeezed his brother's hand and echoed, "Please, sir, we don't want to go back." The words, raw and desperate, cracked something inside Judge Hayes, a crack so deep he swore he could feel it echoing through his bones. He swallowed hard. "This court will take a 15-minute recess," he announced abruptly, his voice rougher than usual. And then he rose quickly, leaving the stunned courtroom behind. A past that won't stay buried. His office felt colder than usual when he stepped inside. The scent of aged books and legal files did nothing to calm the storm raging inside him. He leaned against his desk, pressing his hands against the polished wood, breathing heavily. Why is this affecting me so much? Then he knew. Memories he had spent decades suppressing surged forward. A custody case from long ago. A mother who had tried so hard but was deemed unfit. A child separated from her only family. 6 months later, she was dead. Foster neglect. Malnutrition. A child had slipped through the cracks of the very system he upheld. And he had signed the order. His stomach twisted violently, And for the first time in years, he felt sick with regret. The soft knock on his door barely registered. Judge Emily Carter, his clerk, peered in, concern etched on her face. "I'm fine," he lied. Emily hesitated. "I pulled their complete case history like you asked." She placed the file on his desk. "I think you should see it." The weight of the folder felt heavier than paper as he flipped it open. And what he read made his blood run cold. A system that fails. Each page revealed a pattern. Neglect, foster homes using the twins as a paycheck, social workers overwhelmed with cases and unable to act fast enough. The Langley household, despite no official complaints, had fostered 23 children in the past 5 years. The average stay, 7 months. No emotional engagement, no stability. A revolving door of abandoned souls. "Jesus," Hayes muttered under his breath, rubbing his temples. Emily shifted uncomfortably. "What do we do?" "We." He wasn't alone in this. He exhaled slowly. "We find a way to keep them from going back into that cycle." "But legally." "I know," he cut in. "Legally, I can't just decide to adopt them. But there has to be a way." Emily nodded, determination flickering in her eyes. "I'll dig deeper. Maybe there's a loophole." As she left, Hayes stared at the file, at the small, hopeful faces clipped to the front. He had spent his life upholding the law. But now, for the first time, he wondered, was the law enough? Back in the courtroom. 15 minutes later, as he took his seat behind the bench, every eye in the courtroom was on him. The boys stood exactly where he had left them, hands still clasped, waiting. Mrs. Langley looked annoyed, as if this delay was interfering with her plans. Judge Hayes cleared his throat, his voice steady but weighted. "I have reviewed the case further and have some concerns regarding the twins' placement." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Langley's attorney straightened. "Your Honor, the paperwork is in order." Hayes leveled him with a look that could freeze fire. "I'm placing a temporary hold on their placement renewal," he announced, "until further investigation is conducted." Brock inhaled sharply. James's fingers tightened around his brother's. Langley's lawyer objected, citing legal precedent, but Hayes silenced him with a simple, unwavering glare. He turned back to the boys. For the first time in a long time, he did something that wasn't by the book. He let them see him soften. "We're going to figure this out," he promised. For the first time, James smiled, and something inside Judge Hayes told him, this was just the beginning. The battle begins. The morning air was crisp, yet the weight of responsibility made it feel suffocating. Judge Samuel Hayes sat in his dimly lit office, staring at the thick case file before him. The picture of Brock and James Matthews was clipped to the front, their brown eyes staring back at him. Wide, hopeful, desperate. Their pleas still echoed in his head. "Please adopt us, sir." Something inside him had cracked that day. A man who had spent 15 years priding himself on his emotional detachment had finally met a case that refused to let go. Samuel Hayes was not a father. He never had been, never intended to be. His life was order, logic, and law. But for the first time, law and justice felt like two very different things. And now, he had done something reckless. He had placed a hold on the twins' foster placement, a move that would not go unnoticed by the system. A knock at the door made him snap out of his thoughts. His clerk, Emily Carter, stepped in, holding a fresh stack of files. "You look like you haven't slept," she noted, setting the papers down. "I haven't," Hayes admitted, rubbing his temple. "Did you find anything?" Emily pulled out a separate folder. "I dug into the Langley household. Officially, they have no infractions, but unofficially, well, I talked to a few social workers off the record. Kids who have stayed there don't report physical abuse, but they describe it as cold. No real affection. Just a place to eat and sleep until they're moved again." Hayes exhaled sharply. "A legal prison." Emily nodded. "Exactly." He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. And yet there's no legal grounds to remove them unless we find proof of abuse or financial fraud. She hesitated. There might be a way. Hayes straightened. I'm listening. Emily slid a document across the desk. There's a law allowing a judicial guardian placement in extreme cases. You would need to prove that neither their current foster home nor any of the immediate available options are in their best interest. But Hayes glanced up, catching the hesitation in her voice. But what? But if you personally step in as a guardian, even temporarily, you'd be under scrutiny from the ethics committee. It's a gray area, and people are going to ask questions about why you got involved. Hayes tapped his fingers against the desk. Questions I don't have an answer for. Emily sighed. And one more thing. You'd be going up against a system that doesn't like being challenged. He knew that all too well. The twins' last night in limbo. Later that evening, Hayes found himself standing outside the group home where Brock and James had been placed since he put the hold on their foster placement. The modest brick building sat behind a rusted chain-link fence, its peeling paint and sagging gutters making it look more like a forgotten institution than a home. He stepped inside, greeted by the sterile smell of disinfectant and the low hum of fluorescent lights. A tired-looking woman at the front desk barely glanced up as she gestured toward the common area. The twins sat on a worn-out couch, close together, as if afraid to be separated. Brock was flipping through a tattered comic book, while James stared at the floor, hugging a small sketchpad to his chest. When they noticed him, Brock immediately sat up. Judge Hayes. James followed suit, his expression cautious but curious. Hayes took a seat across from them. Just checking in. How are you boys holding up? Brock attempted a shrug, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Fine. James remained silent, his fingers tightening around his sketchpad. Hayes leaned forward slightly. I know you're worried, but I promise I won't let you go back to the Langleys. The twins exchanged a glance. It was Brock who spoke again. You mean it? For the first time in a long time, Hayes didn't need the weight of the law to confirm his decision. I mean it. James suddenly reached into his sketchpad, flipping through pages before carefully tearing one out. He hesitated before handing it to Hayes. It was a drawing. A house, simple but warm, with flowers in front and a tree beside it. In the middle stood 3 figures, 2 small and 1 tall. Hayes' throat tightened. This is beautiful, James. James didn't respond, but his eyes searched Hayes' face, as if trying to see if the judge understood the meaning behind it. Hayes swallowed hard. He did. The courtroom battle. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. Attorneys, social workers, and even reporters filled the benches. The moment Hayes had filed his motion for emergency guardianship, word had spread like wildfire. His opponent, the system itself. Langley's lawyer stood first, his suit crisp, his tone polished. Your Honor, this is highly unusual. Judge Hayes has no familial connection to these children. This is an emotional overreach, nothing more. Hayes kept his expression neutral as he stood to respond. This is not about me. This is about ensuring that these boys are not placed back into a system that has failed them repeatedly. Langley's lawyer scoffed. You have no grounds to argue that their placement was inadequate. There were no official complaints against my client. Because children in the system rarely get a say in where they go, Hayes countered, his voice calm but firm. But if we're discussing facts, then let's talk facts. The Langley household has taken in 23 children in 5 years. The average stay, 7 months. A home is more than just a roof and a meal. These boys deserve stability, not to be shuffled around for a government check. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Langley's lawyer shifted uncomfortably but pressed on. Even so, Your Honor, it is inappropriate for a sitting judge to personally involve himself in this manner. It raises serious ethical concerns. The presiding judge, an older woman named Margaret Chen, adjusted her glasses. Judge Hayes, do you understand the implications of this request? This is unprecedented. Hayes met her gaze. I do, Your Honor. And I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe this was in their best interest. Judge Chen sighed, flipping through the file before setting it down. Silence stretched through the room before she finally spoke. I will grant a temporary guardianship to Judge Hayes pending further review. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Hayes exhaled, the tension in his chest easing just slightly. Brock and James had just been given a chance. Now he had to prove they belonged somewhere permanent. A new beginning, with uncertainty. Later that evening, Hayes unlocked the door to his quiet, meticulously maintained home. The polished floors and neatly arranged bookshelves suddenly felt sterile. Behind him, the twins hesitated. "This is where you live?" Brock asked, eyes scanning the space. James lingered in the doorway, his fingers gripping the strap of his small backpack. "It's home," Hayes said simply. Brock nudged James. "Told you he'd have fancy stuff." James still looked uncertain. Hayes kneeled slightly to their level. "This isn't just my house anymore. It's yours too. And I know this is new, but we'll figure it out together." Brock nodded slowly, stepping inside first. James followed more hesitantly. As Hayes watched them take in their new surroundings, he felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not just responsibility, not just duty, something much deeper. Something like family. Learning to be a father. The house was too quiet. Judge Samuel Hayes stood in the dimly lit hallway outside the boys' rooms, listening. It had been nearly 2 weeks since Brock and James Matthews moved in, and the transition had been anything but smooth. The first night had been the hardest. Brock had unpacked quickly, pretending to be fine, while James sat on his bed, sketchbook clutched to his chest, barely moving. That night, Hayes had heard muffled sobs behind their closed door, but hadn't known what to do. He wasn't a father. He was a judge, a man who had spent years making calculated, unbiased decisions. Emotions were a liability in his world. But now, there were 2 scared kids under his roof, and he had no idea how to reach them. Morning struggles. The next morning, the scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the kitchen as Hayes set down 2 plates of scrambled eggs and toast on the table. It was a habit. He had always eaten the same breakfast for years, never thinking twice about it. Brock plopped down in a chair, giving the food a dubious look. Do you have syrup?" "Syrup?" Hayes frowned. "For the eggs." Hayes blinked. "You put syrup on eggs?" Brock nodded as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Yeah, makes it better." James sat down across from his brother, silent as usual. He picked at his food with slow, careful movements, eyes focused on his plate, his sketchbook resting beside him like a security blanket. Hayes sighed, already feeling the unfamiliar exhaustion of parenting. "I don't have syrup." Brock groaned dramatically. "Man, what kind of house is this?" Hayes shot him a dry look. "A house with reasonable food habits." Brock smirked and dug in anyway. James remained quiet, eating in small bites. Hayes studied them, trying to read between the lines. He knew they were still wary of him, still waiting for the moment they'd have to pack up and leave again. But he had made a promise. And Samuel Hayes wasn't the kind of man who broke promises. The first real argument. That afternoon, Hayes had a meeting downtown, and he trusted the boys to stay home for a couple of hours. When he returned, however, the house was not as he left it. Brock and James stood in the kitchen, eyes wide with guilt. The floor was covered in flour, eggshells, and what looked like an attempt at pancakes. The entire room smelled of burnt batter. "What happened?" Brock pointed at James. "He said I couldn't flip it high, and I told him I could." James scowled. "Yeah, well, you didn't." "Did too." "Did not." Hayes rubbed his temples. "Enough." He took in the mess and let out a slow breath. "First of all, who told you two you could cook?" Brock grinned sheepishly. "Nobody told us we couldn't." Hayes crossed his arms. "That's not how rules work." James dropped his gaze. Sorry. The apology was soft, barely above a whisper, and something about it made Hayes hesitate. The boys weren't just afraid of getting in trouble. They were afraid of his reaction, and that realization hit him harder than he expected. Look, I'm not mad, Hayes said, lowering his voice. But if you want to try cooking, you need to ask first. And you clean up after yourselves. Brock nodded quickly, but James remained still. Hayes kneeled slightly to his level. James swallowed hard. You're not mad. Hayes frowned. I just said I'm not. James shifted uncomfortably, gripping his sleeves. When we made a mess before, they'd yell. And then we had to go. Hayes' stomach clenched. No wonder they were so scared. No one is sending you away, he said, his voice softer. You're not in trouble. We'll clean up together. James hesitated but nodded. It wasn't much, but it was a step. Nightmares and broken promises. That night, Hayes woke to a sound he hadn't heard before. Soft whimpers coming from down the hall. He followed the noise to James' room. James was tangled in his blankets, his breathing uneven, his small frame shaking. Without thinking, Hayes knelt beside the bed and gently shook his shoulder. James, wake up. James gasped, his eyes flying open in panic. Hayes held up his hands. It's okay. You were having a bad dream. James' breathing was shallow, his hands clenching the sheets so tightly his knuckles were white. Want to talk about it? Hayes asked. James shook his head. Hayes sighed and sat on the edge of the bed. All right, but you're safe now. I promise. James clutched his sketchbook to his chest. People promise a lot of things. The words were quiet, too old for a child his age. Hayes swallowed. I won't break this one, he said simply. James didn't respond, but he didn't turn away either. The system strikes back. The next morning, Hayes arrived at the courthouse to find an envelope waiting for him. The moment he saw the sender, his stomach dropped. Judicial Ethics Committee. Inside was a formal notice. Judge Samuel Hayes is under investigation for conflict of interest regarding the guardianship of minors Brock and James Matthews. Hayes set the paper down, his jaw tightening. The system was pushing back, and if he didn't fight harder, he might lose the boys forever. A battle for family. A notice of war. Judge Samuel Hayes sat at his desk, the weight of the thin envelope pressing down on him, as if it carried the full force of the judicial system itself. He had seen enough of these in his career: disciplinary reviews, ethics violations, procedural challenges, but never had one been about him. The letter was crisp, the ink stark against the cream-colored paper. No TIC of V ist I J.A. Hello. T.O. Honorable Judge Samuel Hayes, R.E. Review of Judicial Conduct and Potential Conflict of Interest. The Ethics Committee is formally investigating your personal involvement in the guardianship of Brock and James Matthews. A hearing has been scheduled to determine whether your actions compromised judicial integrity. Failure to comply may result in suspension, disbarment, or loss of guardianship rights. Your immediate response is required. The words were precise, cold, unforgiving. This was war. Hayes set the letter down, running a hand through his hair. He wasn't naive. He knew that taking the twins in had been a risk. But now, the system he had served for years was turning against him. If he lost this battle, it wouldn't just be his career on the line. It would be Brock and James, the boys who would not break. That evening, Hayes walked through the front door, the warmth of the house a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside. Brock was in the living room, sprawled across the couch with a sketchpad, drawing something with bold, confident strokes. James sat at the kitchen table, quietly coloring, his small hands moving carefully over the paper. When Brock spotted Hayes, he sat up immediately. Hey, Dad. You're home late. The word Dad still sent an unfamiliar jolt through Hayes. Brock had started using it casually, like it had always been true. James, on the other hand, never called him anything. Not Judge, not Sir, not even Samuel. Just silence. Hayes hesitated before pulling out a chair across from James. "I need to talk to you both." James looked up, his dark eyes wary. Brock's easy expression faltered. "Are we in trouble?" Hayes shook his head. "No, but something's happening. Some people don't think I should be allowed to take care of you." James' pencil stopped mid-stroke. Brock frowned. "Ooh, that's stupid." "It's complicated," Hayes admitted. "The ethics committee is reviewing my case. If they decide I crossed a line, they could take you away." James went rigid. "No way," Brock said fiercely. "That's not fair. We chose you." James clenched his hands. "They're going to move us again." His voice was so small, it nearly broke Hayes' heart. "No," Hayes said immediately. "Not without a fight." James looked at him for a long moment. Then, in a whisper, he said, "People fight for things they love." Hayes inhaled sharply. "I love you both," he admitted, the words raw but undeniable. "And I'm not going to let them take you from me." Brock exhaled, relief flickering across his face. "Good, 'cause I was ready to punch someone." Hayes smiled, but James didn't. His fingers twisted around his colored pencil, his knuckles white. "What if they don't care?" "They will," Hayes promised. But the truth was, he wasn't sure. The attack from within. The hearing was scheduled for Friday. 4 days. 4 days to build a defense. 4 days to stop the system from tearing apart what had become his family. Hayes sat in his office late into the night, reviewing every possible legal argument he could make. The problem was, the law was against him. Judges were never supposed to personally intervene in their cases. His decision to take the twins in wasn't just unusual, it was unprecedented. His phone buzzed. "Emily Carter, clerk. You need to see this. Now." His stomach tightened. He opened the attached document and nearly dropped his phone. A formal motion to remove Hayes as guardian had just been filed. And the signature at the bottom. Judge Daniel Harper. His mentor. The man who had once told him, "Never let emotions cloud your judgment, Sam." Betrayal burned through him. Harper wasn't just challenging him. He was trying to destroy him. A desperate plea. The next morning, Hayes met with Harper in his chambers. The older judge looked at him with a mixture of pity and stern resolve. "You knew this was coming, Sam." Hayes dropped the motion on his desk. "You did this." Harper folded his hands. "You forced my hand. The system can't work if judges start taking children into their homes. You made this personal." "It is personal," Hayes snapped. "You think this is about me wanting to be a hero. Those kids don't belong in the system anymore. They deserve a home." Harper sighed. "I get it. I do. But the law is the law. And if you break it for them, what's to stop another judge from doing the same for the wrong reasons?" Hayes clenched his fists. "And what if following the law means failing them?" Harper was silent. "This system is broken," Hayes continued. "And you know it." Harper looked away. "There are rules for a reason." Hayes exhaled sharply. "So that's it. You'd rather let the law win than do what's right." Harper's jaw tightened. "I'm doing my job." "No," Hayes said quietly. "You're protecting yourself." Harper's face flickered with something. Guilt? Doubt? But he didn't respond. Hayes turned on his heel and left. The hearing. The room was packed. Reporters, lawyers, judges, and in the back, sitting side by side, were Brock and James. Hayes took a deep breath as he stepped forward. Judge Chen sat at the head of the room, her expression unreadable. "Judge Hayes, you are here today to defend your actions regarding the guardianship of Brock and James Matthews. Do you have anything to say before we begin?" Hayes looked at the committee, then at the boys. Then he made his choice. "I won't apologize," he said simply. Because I did what was right. A murmur ran through the room. These boys aren't just names on a file. They're not statistics. They're children. Children who have been shuffled from home to home with no say in their future. They stood in my courtroom and asked for a chance. And I gave them one. Judge Chen's expression didn't change. You defied legal precedent. I upheld justice, Hayes countered. Harper stood. Your Honor, if we allow this, we set a dangerous precedent. Hayes turned to him. And if we don't, we tell every child in the system that they're alone. That no one will fight for them. Silence. Then a small voice spoke. It was James. Judge Hayes is our dad. Gasps rippled through the room. James' hands trembled, but his voice remained strong. No one else ever stayed. No one else ever listened. But he did. Brock stood beside him. If you take him away, you take us away. And I won't let that happen. The weight of their words pressed against the room. Judge Chen studied them. Then she turned back to Hayes. And after a long pause, she finally said, Motion to remove Judge Hayes as guardian is denied. Hayes' breath left him in a rush. He turned to the boys, and for the first time, James smiled. Not just a small, cautious smile, a real one. They had won. The weight of a promise. The gavel falls, but the battle isn't over. The sound of the courtroom's final ruling still echoed in Judge Samuel Hayes' mind long after everyone had left. Motion to remove Judge Hayes as guardian is denied. He had won. And yet, as he stepped outside, feeling the cold afternoon air hit his face, the weight of responsibility sank deeper into his chest. This wasn't just a legal victory. This was fatherhood. Brock and James weren't just names in a file anymore. They weren't case numbers, weren't just another tragic story in a broken system. They were his boys. And now he had to prove that they had made the right choice in trusting him. The first morning as a real family. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the warmth of cinnamon toast filled the kitchen the next morning. Hayes was at the stove, flipping pancakes, real ones, not the half-burnt disasters the boys had made before. Brock stumbled in first, his hair a mess of curls, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Are we having pancakes? Yeah, Hayes said, glancing over. Figured you deserved a proper breakfast. Brock sat at the table, mouth twitching into a grin. With syrup? Hayes sighed. Yes, with syrup. Brock gasped dramatically. I knew you had it in you, Judge Dad. Hayes shook his head, hiding his smirk. James entered next, quieter, as always. He glanced around the kitchen like he was still adjusting to the idea that this was his home. He hesitated before sitting beside Brock, clutching his ever-present sketchbook to his chest. Hayes set plates in front of them. Eat up. James hesitated before taking a bite. He chewed slowly, then looked up at Hayes. This is good, he said softly. Hayes felt something warm settle in his chest. Maybe he was getting the hang of this. An unfamiliar challenge. Parent-teacher conferences. By the end of the week, Hayes found himself in a situation far more terrifying than a courtroom battle. A school meeting. Sitting in tiny chairs in a brightly colored classroom, he felt out of place. His black suit didn't quite fit in among the posters of the alphabet and stick figure artwork lining the walls. Miss Landers, Brock's teacher, cleared her throat. It's nice to finally meet you, Judge Hayes. He adjusted his tie. Likewise. She glanced at Brock's file. Brock is energetic. Hayes glanced at the boy beside him, who was currently spinning a pencil like it was a ninja weapon. That's a polite way to put it, Hayes said dryly. He's bright, Miss Landers continued, but he struggles with authority. He doesn't always take direction well. Brock rolled his eyes. Because some directions are dumb. Hayes gave him a look, and Brock sighed. Okay, fine. I'll try harder. Miss Landers smiled. That's all I ask. Then she turned to James. James is incredibly gifted, she said. His artwork is beyond his age level. But she hesitated. He doesn't participate. He doesn't raise his hand. He doesn't speak much at all in class. Hayes glanced at James, who was staring at his lap. "Is that true?" he asked gently. James nodded without looking up. Miss Landers continued carefully. "I think James has a lot to say. He just doesn't always believe people want to hear it." Hayes' heart clenched. "I want to hear it," he said. James finally met his gaze. Something flickered there. Hope, maybe. A ghost from the past. That evening, as they drove home, Rock chattered about school while James remained quiet. Hayes glanced at the boy in the rearview mirror. "You okay, James?" James hesitated. "Why do you care?" The question caught Hayes off guard. "Because you matter," Hayes said simply. "Because I'm your dad now." James was silent for a long time. Then, in a whisper, he said, "People leave." Hayes tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "I won't." James didn't answer. But for the first time, he looked like he wanted to believe it. Then Hayes' phone buzzed. A text from Emily. "You need to see this. Urgent." His stomach dropped. The threat that could take everything away. An hour later, Hayes sat in his office, staring at the document Emily had handed him. A legal petition. Filed by Marie Simmons, the twins' biological mother. She wanted them back. A mother's return. The past comes knocking. Judge Samuel Hayes sat in his dimly lit office, the glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows across the legal petition in front of him. Petition for custody restoration. Marie Simmons. The name sent a chill down his spine. For the past 2 months, he had built something real with Brock and James. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. A life of morning pancakes, school drop-offs, late-night art sessions, and whispered promises that they would never have to move again. And now, just as the boys were starting to trust him, the woman who had abandoned them was back. Hayes leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He knew the law. Biological parents always had the strongest claim. If Marie Simmons could prove she had turned her life around, this judge, the one who had fought harder than ever before, would have no legal right to keep them. The thought made his stomach twist. A soft knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. Emily Carter, his clerk, stepped inside, clutching a thick file. "I pulled everything I could find on Marie Simmons. It's complicated." Hayes exhaled sharply. "Tell me." Emily opened the file. She lost custody 4 years ago due to neglect. Drug abuse, unstable housing. The boys were removed after a neighbor reported that they hadn't been fed in 2 days. Hayes swallowed hard. Emily continued. She was arrested for drug possession shortly after, spent a year in rehab, and has been clean ever since. Now she's got a steady job, a small apartment, and a support group vouching for her. Hayes clenched his jaw. And she suddenly wants her kids back. Emily hesitated. She claims she never stopped wanting them. She just wasn't allowed. Hayes said nothing, staring at the paperwork. Emily shifted. Legally, she has a case. If she proves she's fit, she has the right to custody. The words sank deep, heavy as lead. "Does Brock and James know?" he asked. Emily shook her head. "Not yet." Hayes ran a hand through his hair. How was he supposed to tell them? The boys who had stood in his courtroom, clutching each other's hands, begging for a home. The boys who had flinched at raised voices, who had spent their whole lives waiting for the next goodbye. And now he had to tell them that goodbye might be coming. The conversation that changed everything. That evening, Hayes sat on the living room couch, the fire crackling in the background. Brock and James sat across from him, their legs tucked under them on the floor, sketchbooks beside them. They had no idea what was coming. "Boys," Hayes started, his voice steady but heavy. "I need to talk to you about something important." James looked up, instantly wary. Brock frowned. "What's wrong?" Hayes hesitated. There was no easy way to say it. "Your mother has filed for custody." Silence. The world seemed to freeze around them. James' hands tightened around his sketchbook. Brock's face twisted in confusion. Our real mom asterisk? Brock asked, like the words felt strange in his mouth. Yes, Hayes said softly. She's been clean for 3 years. She says she's ready to have you back. James stared down at his lap, his breathing shallow. Brock blinked rapidly. But we already have a home. Hayes felt something deep in his chest crack. I know, he said gently, but the court has to consider her request. Brock's hands curled into fists. She left us. She says she didn't want to. James finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Where was she when we needed her? The question lingered in the air, heavy and heartbreaking. Hayes leaned forward, his voice firm. No matter what happens, I need you both to know something. You are not alone. No one is taking you away without a fight. Brock swallowed hard. Do we have to go with her? No, Hayes said immediately. But the judge will decide what's best. James exhaled shakily, closing his sketchbook. Judges don't always get it right. Hayes felt his heart clench. I won't let them get this wrong, he promised. Meeting Marie Simmons. 2 days later, Hayes sat in a small, brightly lit conference room inside the courthouse. Across from him sat Marie Simmons. She didn't look like the woman in the mugshot from her case file. Her once hollow eyes were now clearer, but they held something else. Guilt, regret, desperation. Thank you for meeting with me, she said, her voice thin but steady. Hayes studied her. He had spent years reading people in courtrooms, breaking them down to their core. Mary Simmons was a woman trying to fix what she had broken. He just didn't know if she could. You want Brock and James back, he stated. She nodded. They're my sons. They're my sons, too. The words left his mouth before he could stop them. Marie flinched slightly but held her ground. I never wanted to lose them. You lost them because you weren't there, Hayes said, voice sharp. I was sick, she said, her voice cracking. I was a mess, but I got help, and I've done everything they told me to do. I have a job, a home, and I've been clean for over 3 years. Hayes folded his hands on the table. You didn't contact them. Not once. Marie swallowed. I wasn't allowed. My parental rights were severed. Do you know how many letters I wrote? How many birthdays I missed? Hayes clenched his jaw. I know I hurt them, Marie continued, but they are my babies, and I want to fix this. Hayes exhaled slowly. Fixing it means putting them first. What if what's best for them isn't you? Marie's eyes darkened. Then the courts will decide. The storm before the battle. That night, the house felt heavier than usual. Brock was quieted at dinner. James barely ate. Finally, Brock slammed his fork down. So what happens now? We wait, Hayes said honestly. And we fight. James stared at him. What if we don't win? Hayes met his gaze. Then we make sure your voices are heard. Brock exhaled sharply. She's not the mom we remember. James nodded quietly. We don't want to go. Hayes already knew that. But the court didn't care about what he knew. They cared about proof. And now he had to find a way to prove that Brock and James already belonged where they were. With him, the final battle. A fight for family. Judge Samuel Hayes stood in the courthouse hallway, his heart pounding as he watched Brock and James sitting quietly on a wooden bench. They were dressed neatly, their hands clasped together, just like the day they had first stood in his courtroom and begged him to adopt them. Except today, they weren't fighting against the system. Today, they were fighting against their own past. Their biological mother, Marie Simmons, stood a few feet away, her lawyer murmuring last-minute advice. She looked nervous, tugging at the sleeves of her blazer, but her expression was determined. She had come prepared. And so had Hayes. Emily stepped up beside him, holding a thick folder of evidence. We have everything. Reports, school records, testimonials from teachers. But Sam, she hesitated. You know how these cases go. Courts always favor reunification. Hayes clenched his jaw. Not this time. Emily gave him a look. Are you ready for what happens if you lose? No, he admitted, but I'm not losing. He turned back to the twins, kneeling so he was at their level. Whatever happens today, you won't go through it alone, he said. Brock nodded quickly, but James bit his lip. You promised we wouldn't leave, James whispered. Hayes felt something crack inside his chest. I did, he said softly, and I'm going to keep that promise. He didn't care what he had to do. He was going to win. Inside the courtroom. The courtroom was packed. Reporters sat in the back rows, their pens poised over notepads. A judge sat at the bench, not Hayes this time, but Judge Elaine Navarro, a seasoned family court judge known for following the letter of the law. Hayes sat at the defendant's table, Brock and James beside him, their small frames stiff with anxiety. Across from them sat Marie and her lawyer, a sharp-looking man named Richard Graves. Navarro adjusted her glasses. We are here to determine the custody of Brock and James Matthews. This court's primary concern is the best interests of the children. Counsel may proceed. Graves stood first, walking to the center of the courtroom. Your Honor, my client, Marie Simmons, has worked tirelessly to rehabilitate her life. She has remained clean for over 3 years, holds a stable job, and has secured appropriate housing. She has done everything the court has asked of her. It is time to reunite this family. He gestured toward Marie, who clasped her hands together. I lost them once, she said, her voice trembling. I was sick, but I never stopped loving them. Hayes watched Brock and James out of the corner of his eye. Brock was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. James had curled in on himself, his head bowed. Graves continued. We respect Judge Hayes' care for the boys, but he is not their biological parent. The law states that whenever possible, children should be with their parents. Marie is ready to be their mother again. Silence fell. Then it was Hayes' turn. He rose slowly, buttoning his suit jacket before stepping forward. With all due respect, Your Honor, biology alone does not make a parent, Hayes said. Love does. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. I don't doubt that Mary Simmons wants her sons back. But what matters isn't what she wants. It's what they need. He gestured toward Brock and James. For years, these boys have been shuffled from one home to another. They have been let down by every adult who was supposed to protect them. When they came to me, they weren't just asking for shelter. They were asking for stability, something they had never known. Hayes turned toward the judge, his voice steady. I have school reports, therapist evaluations, and personal statements all confirming that since coming into my care, Brock and James have thrived. They are excelling in school, they are emotionally healthier, and for the first time in their lives, they feel safe. He walked over to the twins. I didn't choose them, Hayes said softly. They chose me. Brock straightened. James finally looked up. I promised them they wouldn't have to leave again, Hayes continued. And I intend to keep that promise. Navarro studied him. Then she turned to Brock and James. You've heard everything. I want to hear from you now. James paled. Brock inhaled sharply. Brock, do you want to return to your mother? Brock sat up straight, his voice clear and unwavering. No. Marie let out a small gasp, but Brock didn't look at her. I don't know her, he said. I remember being hungry. I remember being scared. And I remember no one coming for us. Judge Hayes did. He's my dad. A ripple of whispers spread through the courtroom.